Welcome today to our self-compassion, the unrecognised leadership skills virtual boardroom that's being facilitated by HR Recruit and Marion Hewitt. My name is Jo Thompson and I'm a consultant for HR Recruit. I'm joined today by Marion, who will introduce herself shortly. Marion is going to share with you what self-compassion is, the benefits to self-compassion, and provide an understanding to some of the barriers. If you've got any questions during this session, then please put them into the chat box facility. We do encourage interaction, so if you've got any questions or any comments that you want, then please feel free to contribute. Otherwise, I'm going to hand you over to Marion, who will introduce herself and start the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. It's nice to see people recognise a few names, and some of you will have heard me talk about self-compassion before. My background's a lot of years in HR, and I developed particular interest in wellbeing and positive psychology, and through that, more awareness of the theory and research around self-compassion and how often it's really misunderstood. And then I was developing other programs, and particularly a program called Unleashing You that incorporated self-compassion and why that's beneficial for so many elements of our well-being. And then I was having conversations with they were the ILM now, they now Institute of Leadership, and about having the programme approved. And we had some really interesting discussions around recognising a lot of the things I was talking about from the positive psychology, including the self-compassion element, were actually had outcomes that were effectively conducive and aligned with the competencies and behaviours that we look for in leaders and managers. So really what I would like to share with you today is some of my thoughts, a lot of the research around self-compassion, but actually think about this through the lens of leadership. If you are on a leadership or a management role, actually where this knowledge, these findings and this way of approaching ourselves can actually be really beneficial. So let me go through some of the things around in terms of understanding what self-compassion is. And as Jo said, that's the outline of what we will be covering through this. And compassion as its wider sense is around an openness to suffering with others with a commitment to relieve it. And then if we think about self-compassion, it's about how we treat ourselves with the same kindness. And what we know is that a lot of people find that the challenging element. Another definition here is around the capacity to comfort and soothe ourselves and to motivate ourselves with encouragement when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate. And what we often find is that people will work in a narrative that's much more critical, will be really judgmental internally. And actually what we've learned is that it's a flawed approach. And the model that Christian Neff, who's the main thought leader, if you like, in this area, her and Chris Germer, who was one of the previous quote, she identified 6 factors around self-compassion. So there's the factors that are related to sort of the warmth and the self-kindness, and the factors related to self-coldness. And whereas if we are developing a compassionate approach, we want to be developing and adopting the behaviours linked to self-kindness and less of those on the self-coldness. So learn to have an inner coach and inner friend in terms of our internal narrative, rather than the judgmental, critical voice that can talk to us. About recognising that actually it's okay to find things difficult. Lots of people find things difficult. What I'm dealing with at the moment is difficult, rather than feeling actually alone in that and we're the only person that's finding it. Everybody else is all right, I'm the only one struggling. Recognising that. And then the mindfulness against the over-identification, that's very much about noticing, recognising our feelings and emotions, but not getting totally wrapped up into it and letting it become overwhelm us. So thinking about how we can adopt mindset, develop an internal dialogue that actually is around those habits on the left, the kinder, warmer approaches to ourselves. And then there are different elements of self-compassion. It has a bit of a misunderstanding perhaps as you know, a soft, fluffy, warm behaviour, and yes, it can be. But actually, again, the work of Neff talks about the yin and yang of self-compassion. So sometimes it will be that comforting, soothing, validating internal narrative. But actually, sometimes that self-compassion is about how we act out in the world. It's like the she described it as sort of the mama bear behaviours, when actually we have to act to be protective, to ultimately be kind to ourselves, to protect ourselves. So, you know, things like that would be about the kindness of putting an appropriate barrier around whether you're always available to somebody, you know, saying no. That would be an example of how we might be demonstrating that out in the world. So there are two elements of it that it's worth thinking about. Now, if we then think about benefits to self-compassion to you as a person and then as a leader or in a leadership role, and extensive research in lots of different areas here have shown us various things. So being kinder to yourself is a strong predictor of psychological well-being. And we also, so that's the feelings around general positivity, about self-acceptance, about purpose in life, life satisfaction, all the different elements of psychological well-being as a strong predictor of that. We've also found that being kinder to ourselves actually appears to encourage other behaviours that are conducive to overall well-being. So people are more likely to exercise or have a healthier diet or seek medical help when they're needed, or reduce smoking, which suggests that actually, you know, that kindness to ourselves is a wider sense of looking after and appreciating and valuing ourselves. The most persuasive data is about linking self-compassion to reduced levels of anxiety, stress, and depression. And actually, that's logical if you think about it, because self-criticism is often linked to that internal negative worrying thought. So strong related to a range of illnesses, that self-criticism, and actually self-reassurance, that self-kindness, is inversely related. We also found, it's also been found that people that had higher levels of self-compassion had lower levels of cortisol in their body, which is the chemical that alerts the body to stress. And then obviously we know prolonged stress is linked to anxiety and depression. And self-criticism has been identified as a risk factor in a range of mental illnesses, including social phobia, PTSD, eating disorders, and it's logical that self-kindness can be protective. So lots of things in relation to that part of it, but then also there's positive correlations of being kinder to yourself and wisdom, overall happiness, optimism. You know, optimism is a learned behaviour, it's not a character trait. Worrying less. And also, interestingly, other areas of our functioning around relationships, higher empathetic tendencies have been shown, more likely to forgive in relation to other relationships. So lots of benefits that have been found to self-compassion at an individual level. And then if we think about it at work, when we're performing in our role, and whether we're relating this to ourselves as a leader and a manager, or not in one of those roles, or thinking about other people in leadership and management roles. What we have found is that people that have higher levels of self-compassion are actually more engaged at work. The research, a lot of the research has been in people working within healthcare sectors. But there's more that can be done. There has been some wider stuff, but a lot of it has been in the healthcare sectors, just to put perspective to it. But what they found is that amongst physicians, those that had been proactively developing self-compassion had lower levels of emotional, physical, and cognitive exhaustion, and were more positively engaged. We saw the fact that people were more successful in goal pursuit, and then they were more resilient when things didn't achieve. And if we also know that actually there's a reduced fear of failure, then that kind of makes sense. If I'm not so frightened of failing, I'm more likely to go after something, because a self-compassionate behaviour would be, if something doesn't work, it doesn't define who I am. I'm not useless because I made that mistake. I made that mistake whilst trying to do something. What can I learn from it? So if you sort of join the dots between different areas, we can understand why some of this might work, because people feel able to go to do things because they recognise if they are not as successful as they want, they've done their best and they can learn from a place of kindness. And then where there's been very specific research done in relation to leaders, people in a leadership role and self-compassion, we actually saw the benefits of the role modelling, because given the fact we've seen all these benefits to ourselves as individuals of self-compassion, if we saw our leaders role model, as with all behaviours that are role models, it gives that a more explicit permission. So if we see role modelling, it gives teams access to those behaviours. It also resulted in increased empathy and active listening skills. And obviously lots of areas where having that ability to listen effectively is valuable. People were found to take on more task-related, or more willing to take on helping others, but not in an unhelpful way, but not in a way out of a way that was detrimental to them, not putting others first at expense to themselves, but actually more willing and accessible for support. So people felt more able to reach out and seek for help. One of the ones I thought was actually particularly interesting is that people were viewed as more competent. And where would that also now? Okay, they could be the example that, you know, statistics and research can create links between things. But that was nevertheless something that came up as people who were kinder to themselves. So we can, you know, you can pick that up in terms of the language that's used, the behaviours. They were actually viewed as more competent. And then if we look at the other work around it, will actually increase desire to grow and learn and motivated to improve. And again, that can be linked to the self-kindness behaviours, that actually if things don't always work, then actually that's okay, I can learn from it and do better next time. And then when it's encouraging, when leaders are encouraging that self-compassionate approach, it enables people to access those wider well-being benefits, and in turn group functioning. We know there's an interconnection between well-being and engagement, sort of the paradox as to which feeds which and whether one supports others. And so it makes sense that if we're helping improve well-being, we're going to be improving team functioning, outcomes and performance. Just as a quick aside, in terms of the difference between self-compassion and self-esteem, people often think, you know, they're striving for self-esteem. Well, arguably, the self-compassion, that kindness approach, gives us the benefits that people experience with higher self-esteem, but actually it's a more stable experience. It's more based on self-worth rather than, if you like, measuring against other people. So the benefits without the downside. So lots of things there. And then the gender element is quite interesting as well, because it is complex. But overall, men have been found as to be more self-compassionate than women, but not as big a difference as, if you like, sort of common wisdom might suspect. But where it does align with other data about, you know, we know women have higher levels of negative self-talk than men, which is a self-judgment factor. And we also know that women experience high levels of anxiety and depression. And again, we know that self-compassion has a mediating effect on those. So there is definitely a gender difference. And what could get in the way of people feeling able to be self-compassionate? I mentioned some of this earlier. The fact that it's considered to be, a selfish, self-indulgent behaviour if I'm very kind and soft and warm and nice to myself. When something goes wrong, I'm going to let myself off. I'm not going to learn from it. Whereas actually we know it's different. If we're looking after ourselves as we would a friend, then we actually benefit. It's certainly not a pity party or just about those positive affirmations. There's a clear place sometimes for those, but that's not what the self-compassion is about. It's acknowledging, noticing, changing the internal dialogue and changing the behaviours that we do. And there is, some of you would definitely have seen this, some research I carried out a few years ago now, which was understanding self-compassion amongst female HR professionals. There, we found that there was an understanding that self-compassion was perhaps a good approach, but actually there were very clear barriers to this. So these were linked to the need to put others first, the constantly striving for better, and sense of low self-worth. And if you reflect on the evidence in favour of a self-compassionate approach, we can create arguments that show that all of those actually are flawed thinking. It doesn't create the best outcomes that we want. So what I would like us to think about is, as a leader, so whether you're putting yourself in a position of leadership or thinking in relation to your organisation, how does this insight help you? What might you do differently? How might this impact you? And how might this impact those you lead? So any general thoughts on that? Be interested in people's thoughts. Why? Move on. What's resonated from all the information I've shared?
Marion, there's a couple of bits in the chat box. I'm not sure if it's necessarily related to those particular questions, but there's some stuff in the chat box.
Right. The first question, imposter syndrome for professionals right. That first question is quite a lot in that one, and I would say it's in terms of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is very much linked to the elements of self-doubt. So I would, there has been research around this area in terms of if we are being kinder to ourselves, we can acknowledge when things might not go wrong, but we can also notice when we are looking after when we have done well. So developing greater self-compassion will definitely help in terms of overcoming imposter syndrome. I'd have to take a bit longer to process and think through the bit in terms of linking it to the neurodiversity element of it. But obviously those I know we are seeing increasing. I was reading something the other day about, is it 400% increase in diagnosis of autism in adults in the last year, or some huge figure. So we're definitely seeing a lot more of that, but I need to think a bit more on that one. How can someone balance resisting the fear of failure with a tendency to recklessness? Oh, now there's an interesting, that sounds more like a moral dilemma than John, do you want to elaborate a bit on that, Elaine? I'm quite interested in where you're coming from.
Hello, Marion. Hello, everyone. Interesting session again. What I was just thinking about people that perhaps are over self-confidence and have a good sense of self-esteem and take care of themselves, and their health, emotional, mental, and all that, and how perhaps in some circumstances there's an overconfidence in perhaps their judgments or abilities. So how could someone recognise that and pull back from being perhaps slightly reckless in some of the decisions that they make either in their life or in business?
I guess where I'm reflecting is, I suppose all behaviours go on a continuum, don't they? So from total fear of failure to recklessness and not considering the consequences. So I would suggest that a self-compassionate approach is more that internal dialogue that evaluates from, it's kind of separate actually. It's about how people would evaluate something, but making it not about themselves, if that makes sense. So if they're planning something, and whether it goes well or it goes badly, actually it's how they respond to those outcomes that would show whether it was a compassionate approach or a cold self-coldness approach. But I think the balance, the reduce the fear or risk of failure, I think it is about it being on that continuum, that it is about that acknowledging that things can go wrong, learning from it, but that feels different to actually just going for it without consideration of the consequences, because it doesn't mean you're not considering the consequences. It just means when you're planning and you're evaluating, you're recognizing what the valid influence is. Does that make sense?
It does. And it just popped in my head, actually, that question I thought was probably a rhetorical one, isn't it? But,
yeah, I think, vast majority of behaviours, there's a continuum of them, isn't it? Which is where, we want to be getting it in the right place, and how we can move on to developing that greater compassionate approach. Because a lot of people here will notice and recognise that, if something goes wrong, what's the sort of language that's going through your head? And often it's that beating yourself up, that critical, that judgmental, why on earth didn't I think about that before? Why on earth did I do that? How did I forget that? Rather than actually acknowledging that I did my best. Yes, it's gone wrong, but actually I was doing the best that I could with the resources I have available. People have heard me quote that a lot. It comes from NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and it's a really helpful one, I think, because everybody does the best they can with the resources they have available. Sometimes we have more resources than at other times, but we will generally be doing the best that we can with what we have available to us. What about in terms of the sort of the leadership element? What has resonated with people? What surprised you?
Has anyone got anything they want to contribute?
It feels like it's aligned, while you're thinking, it feels like it's aligned with a lot of other things that we're hearing, sort of the compassionate leadership, other approaches we're talking about to leadership. It kind of aligns and makes sense to me from that perspective. The concept of leadership and management have moved so much over time. But actually, as we're now understanding more about the psychology and the positive psychology, then it makes sense that actually if people are practicing these skills that we know are beneficial to them and their own well-being, that actually it would then show and come out in terms of how they demonstrate competencies that are helpful for them as leaders. But let me just, I don't need to show the slide. I mean, we can develop self-compassion. And if you're somebody that recognises and knows that they have an internal critic, just as the very simple exercise is just notice something. So if something happens and you notice your narrative, and actually if this happens to you, do it as a real write it down exercise, because it's always much more powerful when you actually really think that through. So if something goes wrong, maybe you can think of an example of a time when something hasn't gone right. Can you remember what was happening to you internally? What was the dialogue? What were you saying to yourself? Anybody want to put any examples in the chat? But just think about the way you were talking to yourself when something went wrong. And really reflect on that. Notice the language you're using. Notice the tone of voice you're using. Really think about that. And then think about somebody that you cared about, perhaps your best friend or a colleague you work very closely with, or a family member. And think about if they came to you and told you that they had made this mistake, this thing had happened, because we make mistakes. Think about how you would respond to them. Yeah, catastrophizing, the worst mistake, thinking the worst. Yeah, well, it's amazing where we can get to in a split second and catastrophizing, isn't it? But think about if it was somebody that you cared about. Remember, self-compassion is about being kind to yourself. If this was somebody that you cared about, say your closest friend came and told you about this mistake they'd made, think about how you would speak to them. Again, really write it down. Really think about the language that you use, the tone of voice you're using, and actually compare those two. And often if we take that step back and reflect on that, we realise that we are talking to ourselves in a way we wouldn't dream of talking to somebody else, but somehow we consider it acceptable. And if we value ourselves, now it's all linked to lots of other constructs, you know, self-worth, self-esteem, confidence, whatever language you want to put about it. And looking at the things that are going into the chat. They're all linked. But we want to look at how we can develop that kindness to ourselves, speak to ourselves in the way that we care about. If it's something that is valuable to us, and we should be valuable to ourselves, we should value ourselves, recognise our worth, accept ourselves. I did a series of blogs on unconditional self-acceptance a little while ago. None of these mean that we don't still strive to do things better, strive to grow, but it's coming from a place of acceptance and self-worth and growing from that bit. And I'm not going to pretend that all of these things I've just got a magic wand and we can change our thinking. I wish, but actually what we can do is to practice some very specific techniques. So that exercise I just suggested, in terms of think of something that went wrong, think about how you're talking to yourself and thinking about how you speak to somebody you care about. Just practice that in the moment. Just notice what you're saying and notice how you're responding to yourself when things go wrong, and reframe it. Stop, reflect, and reframe and talk to yourself in a kinder way. Because actually, as the research shows, the benefits, you'll come out stronger and better and improved, and all the things that you're trying to do as an outcome of that. So any further thoughts? I don't know, Jo, do you want to? Yeah. Found that exercise allows me to check in with staff, but it also means you need to work in an environment which enables this. Yeah. And if we go back to sort of the yin and yang bit of self-compassion, as where sometimes the self-compassionate approach is about how we're behaving out into the world, then actually some of the things we need to think about in terms of developing a more self-compassionate approach is perhaps where do I need to put better boundaries? Where do I need to put in habits that are caring for me? If we adopt that whole caring for somebody, and I'm caring for me because I'm worth caring for, that can include things like how accessible you make yourself at work, when you're always available. If somebody comes in and says, have you got 5 minutes? Do you always say yes, whether you have or not? And that, rather than sometimes it might be better to say, well, actually, I've just got this I'm trying to do. Can we catch up? Yeah, we always have to make an assessment, but actually, have we got the balance right? I'm trying to read the things in the chat as well. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the things that are going into that. But definitely practice. You know, our brain is either lazy or efficient, depending which way you think of it. It has well-developed neural pathways. It will follow the route it's used to going. So if you're used to using that self-criticism, and you need to develop the pathways that actually are about how you can then be kinder to yourself, rather than going straight into that rabbit hole of self-judgment, actually how you can notice. Yeah, actually put time in my diary. Downtime, learning to say no. Care is important to you. Yes. Yeah. Looking at what you can learn from things that have gone wrong, so you can approach them differently in the future. Yeah. Learn from them, because, you know, it's all about continuous improvement and growth, which we all want to do. And we know that actually growing and learning is one of the 5 elements of, if you have 5 ways to wellbeing, if you see that bit. But we can be growing from a place of support and caring, rather than growing because we think we're not good enough where we are. Self-compassion and self-worth. They're separate, but they will be linked. So if we have low sense of self-worth, in fact, there is research, if we have low sense of self-worth, we don't put value on ourselves, we are much more likely to then be critical of ourselves and be less compassionate. So what we actually know is that people who have developed a greater levels of self-compassion consequently will also develop greater levels of self-worth. Yes, quite a useful tool for people that are struggling. Yeah, what are they saying to themselves? Yeah, what would you say to somebody that somebody else in this situation? Yeah, it's a great tool to do. Thank you. Some great things going into the chat here. Any other comments? We were debating whether to go into breakout rooms, but we know half the people disappear if we do that. So we're going to just keep the discussion here and any thoughts that people want to add. Any other perspectives? One of my main aims really is just to encourage thinking, and just your approach to things, because it's just think it's an interesting perspective from the leadership. So I had some very interesting conversations with the ILM in terms of, recognising it's about the behaviours and the competency development and the routes to those. So thinking of that. Any other thoughts?
I think there's an interesting link to culture in organisations as well, because I've worked in some organisations where the leadership were bullish, let's say, and their tolerance of self-compassion or anything like it would be limited, if not, negative. So I think maintaining your own robustness and keeping yourself sane in those environments is quite challenging. And I think there's more and more pressure on people, and there's more and more anxiety just in society generally. So being able to have the robustness personally to exercise self-compassion, but then also see it in your own teams and play that upwards, if they are pushing too much, then it takes a lot of balls, really.
Yes, and some of these things we almost get into that catch-22 when we talk about, there was the thing about self-worth, self-acceptance, self-compassion earlier. It's how you, I suppose, get off that negative treadmill of things, but actually how you can start to develop. And I agree, if we look at the yin and yang of self-compassion, obviously some of the more outward things can be much more challenging to demonstrate if you feel you're in a culture that doesn't allow it. But we can still practice some of the internal habits of self-compassion that access the benefits of that. I mean, don't think it's going to be an instant panacea. It's not going to change everything, but actually we can really benefit from just noticing. And I will say, if we look at that research around the role modelling, when we have got leaders or can have leaders that are on board with it, which is where a lot of the thinking is going. But I totally get that there are some cultures that have a long way to go, or some people have a long way to go in terms of self-awareness. People, expectations we have for ourselves are very different from what we have for others. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, we allow other people a whole lot more slack than we usually allow ourselves. Yeah. And that's that. Understand that everyone is human. Expect that's very much go back to those 6 factors I talked about earlier. That common humanity against isolation. When we're not being compassionate, we think we're the only one that's useless. We're the only one that makes a mistake. We're the only one that forgets birthdays or types in a figure wrong on a budget. Whereas actually it's recognising that everybody does different things. Yeah. Any other thoughts? No. I've just mentioned it. Well, I won't talk through the exercise about that. You can develop self-compassion, and I would encourage you to practice this and think about it yourself. Just catch your thoughts. We do so much of so much of what we do and process is unconscious, that actually the first thing to do is to bring it into conscious awareness. And when you start noticing your internal voice and how you're speaking to yourself, just catch it, reframe it, talk to yourself in the same way as you would somebody that you can care about. Okay. And if I just mention I've run these a lot with Joe, but I do these regularly. If you're, it's linking all to your overall look at looking after yourself and self-care. I run regular self-care power hour sessions as freebies at lunchtime. You'd be welcome to join one of those. And I mentioned that the program I developed, so this was very much part of the self-compassion element, was part of this program called Unleashing You, which is as an open program, and it's also being run as part of sort of management leadership training programs in organisations. So if you're interested in finding out more, please get in touch. But I'm sure Joe will share details and things afterwards. But any other questions or points? Because I always love having debates around this topic. Yeah, name your internal voice. Yeah, separate the two. Notice the tone you use as well. Well, thank you very much for all the chat and contributions that have gone into the chat. Really appreciate that. So it's good to have different viewpoints, and yeah, there's a couple of things there I'm going to go back and reflect on, but thank you. So Joe, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks very much, Marion. We'll send out some communication to everyone that's signed up for the event, and I'll put a post on LinkedIn this afternoon. So if you would like a copy of the slides or the recording, then put a comment against the post. Our next event is this Thursday at 12:30, and it's called Dignity at Work. A link to sign up to this event will be detailed in the email. We'll also send out a short feedback survey to everyone that's signed up. So if you've got a few minutes to complete it, then your feedback will be much appreciated. If anyone is recruiting, we've also got accountants to recruit, FD recruit, and executive recruit within the group. But otherwise, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to Marion for her time and effort in putting the event together, and also to everyone that's signed up. I hope you've taken a few things away from it. Thank you very much.